I've started to see buses out and about, which means students are heading back to school. It's the perfect time to focus on one of America's most iconic and beautiful campuses, Princeton University. From its beautiful architecture to its meticulously planned quadrangles and lush gardens, Princeton stands as a testament to the blend of academic excellence and aesthetic brilliance. Today, we're peeling back the layers of this storied institution and exploring its rich history and architectural evolution. I sat down with Barksdale Maynard, a historian and author who has extensive knowledge of Princeton's architecture and legacy. Maynard, who refers to Princeton as America's campus, has spent years studying and documenting the unique features that make the university so extraordinary. As someone who, prior to this conversation, had a pretty limited knowledge of Princeton's history, I thought this was really interesting, not only because we talked quite a bit about American history, but also how Princeton fits into that and how much of it took place there. So I hope you enjoy this conversation, and I know you will learn something new. Welcome to Grandma's Silver, where tradition meets today. I'm Allie, your host and the founder of the Grand Millennial Lifestyle. Here, we blend aesthetics with nostalgia, engaging in conversations with lifestyle brands, designers, and more to rediscover the timeless charm of the past. Join me as we journey from home to heart, illuminating the past and polishing the present with the gleam of Grandma's Silver. Well, Barksdale, I'm so excited to take the time to chat today. I was thinking it's back to school. So I thought it would be an interesting time to kind of talk about Princeton University. It's a very well-known institution academically, but it also has a really unique architectural heritage that I'm excited to have you tell everyone about. But I'd like to give you the opportunity to just share a little bit more about your background, what it is that you do, and perhaps even your connection to the university.
Well, thanks, Allie. It's great to be here. I'm a writer. I've written 8 books. 2 of them are about the history of Princeton University. I went to Princeton as an undergraduate. I arrived there 40 years ago this fall. And I've had a long experience with Princeton, having studied there. Later, I taught there. I've written these 2 books. One is about Woodrow Wilson as a Princeton student, professor, president of Princeton. The other is called Princeton, America's Campus, and it's the first architectural history of Princeton University. Princeton is the 4th oldest college in the country after Harvard, William & Mary, and Yale, and yet Princeton never had an architectural history, not really. So it was a privilege to write this book, and it tries to introduce everybody to this extraordinary campus. I call it America's campus because it set the pattern that's been followed by many other campuses. In fact, the word campus, as applied to a college grounds, that was invented at Princeton. Yeah, so that's where campus begins. That's why I call it America's campus.
Okay. Oh, that's really interesting. I had no idea. Before I start asking you, we start talking more about the architecture, could we talk briefly just about Princeton, its history, provide a bit of background and context for the rest of this conversation?
Well, I think the takeaway from this conversation is anybody listening, go see the Princeton campus, go visit it. About 800,000 tourists visit the Princeton campus every year. It is a marvelous place to visit. Where is it located? It is halfway between Philadelphia and New York City in central New Jersey. So it's very accessible. If you're going back and forth on the New Jersey Turnpike, it's an easy trip over to see Princeton. And it's a marvelously attractive place to visit for a day trip. There are great places to eat. And then you can stroll around the town, which is filled with historic architecture. And then, of course, the campus itself, which has been in the town of Princeton since the 1740s or 50s. It's an extraordinarily old American institution. I would always say to my students, this is a college that's older than the nation. It is an institution older than the United States. And it's a marvelous place to walk around.
Of course, I've heard of Princeton, especially being in the Philadelphia main line. It's really not that far. I really didn't realize how storied its history was when I was looking at some of the architectural elements in the buildings, which we will talk about. it really blew my mind that it's not more widely discussed because there is so much that has happened there. And it predates, like you said, I mean, it predates America. But I know Gothic Revival architecture is sort of its defining style.
Well, I think one of the things that's exceptional about Princeton is the variety of the architecture. We just visited the University of Virginia with my son who's looking at colleges, and the University of Virginia is famously beautiful and gorgeous and wonderful, but it is slightly monotonous, dare I say it, with the classical revival architecture, and every building is red brick with white columns. And after a while, you begin to wonder even which building is which. UVA is lovely, but Princeton is not like that. Princeton has almost an example of the architectural style of every phase of American architecture, going back to the colonial period, federal period, Greek revival, Italianate, the Victorian, whole panoply of Victorian styles. And then, of course, as you mentioned, the Gothic Revival style that comes in the 1890s. And Gothic dominates Princeton from the 1890s until the Great Depression hits around 1930. And so I suppose we're most famous for that Gothic style of architecture. But then the architecture continues beyond that. And if, like me, you're interested in modern architecture, not everybody is, but if you like modern architecture, there are pretty neat examples of modernism from many prominent architects, and then into postmodern, and then into neo-modern. So I think Princeton is really, it gives you an architectural tour in a sense of the United States. I say to students, we don't have a Frank Lloyd Wright, but we have almost everybody else. And
Mhm.
it's a fun place to explore.
So, how did, especially during a time when a lot of the architecture, though the universities were a bit limited at the time, they followed a similar style, as you even mentioned, with the University of Virginia and, the rotunda. And how did we wind up seeing this shift? And perhaps it's the architect. What was that shift to the more European Gothic revival? Do we know why that happened?
I think what I learned writing my book, Princeton America's Campus, is that the campus really was designed by very intelligent people over a period of centuries. And these people were shaping the campus to solve problems of their time, educational problems of their time. And so the colonial period had one approach, the early 19th century had a different approach, and then the much expanding college of the late 19th century, a whole different approach. And then you get new types of buildings that are needed because, my gosh, we need a hockey rink, we need a football stadium, things that hadn't even existed
Yeah.
in the antebellum period. So essentially, designing a campus is solving an ever-changing series of educational problems. And I think Princeton does that with extraordinary intelligence. Each phase gives us a really good example of a type of architecture that was meant to solve that specific educational problem. And so I think it's not just a history of architecture, but it's a history of American education and a history of American aspirations, I think, as well, because there's always been a sense that Princeton is a special place, the school for statesmen in the Revolutionary period that turned out so many extraordinary figures who founded our country, and Princeton's role in the Civil War, Princeton's extraordinary role in World War I, again World War II, and so forth. Princeton has contributed, and of course, Princeton has produced two presidents, President Madison, President Woodrow Wilson. Those who wish that Michelle Obama would run for president, well, that would be a third. Michelle Obama was a student when I was there. So Princeton has produced extraordinary people. There's a sense at Princeton of a kind of high-mindedness and significance in the life, not just of New Jersey, but in the life of the nation.
You've mentioned some of the architects and how vast that pool was.
I really wondered all through researching Princeton, why is the architecture so exceptionally good? generally. It's not all good, but a lot of it is exceptionally good. I think it's because Princeton was midway between New York and Philadelphia. So Princeton is drawing from the most talented New York architects, like Richard Morris Hunt, and then it's drawing from especially from the great Philadelphia architects, from Robert Smith in the colonial period, right up to Robert Venturi, the great postmodernist in our own times. These are Philadelphians. So I think that the proximity to those cities allows Princeton to take advantage of this extraordinary architectural talent. Because no offense to Boston or even Chicago, but I think especially in the 19th century, Philadelphia and New York were really the centers of architectural innovation in the United States.
The buildings, the spaces, I know even the gardens and the quadrangles have a lot of planning that went into them.
I think one of the things that makes Princeton distinctive is that in the early days, when there were very few universities, Princeton was prominent, and Princeton was famous as one that was not in a city. Most universities and big colleges in the 19th century were in cities. So Harvard is in the Boston metro area, Yale is in New Haven, University of Pennsylvania, of course, in Philadelphia. William and Mary, extremely old, but it's in the town of Williamsburg. Princeton really is in a village. Princeton in the 19th century was a tiny place, a little stop on the main post road between New York and Philadelphia. So Princeton has a rural quality, which is unusual among American universities.
Mm.
And the way the campus grew, and you'll see this if you visit, it has a kind of loose, open feel. Now we have the quadrangles, which we'll talk about, but generally speaking, there's lots of green space, lots of trees, lots of shrubs, lots of vistas. It feels expansive, small, but the feeling is of spaciousness and a kind of generous allotment of greensward and paths. This is very much part of the Princeton ethos, is very fine architecture, but the setting is lovely. The setting is kind of rural. And we've tried to keep that through the 20th century. Whether that survives the 21st century, I'm not sure.
Some of the buildings, and the one that particularly caught my interest, which I had, and I think you even mentioned early on here, is it Nassau Hall that had a connection to the Revolutionary War?
That's right. Nassau Hall is so important. When the Princetonian thinks about Princeton, we think about Old Nassau, the oldest building on the campus. Nassau Hall was the entire Princeton University in the colonial period. That is, Nassau Hall had the classrooms, it had the dining room, it had the student rooms, it had the chapel. I mean, the whole college was in Nassau Hall. And Nassau Hall, very carefully designed. The committee that created Nassau Hall, they studied Yale, Harvard, William and Mary. They looked at those buildings and they said Nassau Hall is going to be the very largest and the most beautiful. Nassau Hall is about double the size of Connecticut Hall at Yale. Princetonian loves to draw comparisons to Yale that are grossly unfavorable to Yale University. So we have a building twice as big as Yale's, and it's really Nassau Hall, in fact, said to have been the largest building on the North American continent when it was completed in the mid-1750s. So Nassau Hall alone is a major monument. And although it's burned a couple of times, it's better preserved than the Wren building at the College of William and Mary. So Nassau Hall is a national treasure as far as I'm concerned. It was here that the Battle of Princeton reached its final phase, with literally the British holed up inside Nassau Hall like a fortress, and Alexander Hamilton firing his cannon from Cannon Green and bombarding Nassau Hall, and the cannonballs crashing through the windows. A cannonball decapitates the portrait of King George II. It's an exciting time to have been on the Princeton campus in the great final throes of the Battle of Princeton, raging around Nassau Hall.
School was still in session. Is that what I read? They were still that just there?
I'd have to remind myself if school was still going on, but I know that the Congress of the United States met in Nassau Hall at one point. And so you had the great political leaders of the nation, the legendary figures that we all know of, and they're living in the student dormitory rooms alongside other students and
Isn't
complaining
that
of the terrible smell of the laundry of these undergraduates in the halls of Nassau Hall. So that was an uneasy mixture.
Could we talk a little bit about I don't love the word aesthetic, but what Nassau Hall looks like? What were some of its, or are some of its defining features? And perhaps continue on that same journey, if you will, with some of the other esteemed buildings on site.
I think the key to the early architecture at Princeton is that it is colonial, sometimes called Georgian, and that is it intends to follow the classical vocabulary of architecture. So you're going to see pediments, you're going to see bullseye windows, you're going to see keystones above openings. It's very much in the Philadelphia aesthetic of architecture of the middle of the 18th century. And this is a cherished style at Princeton. And when you get into the 19th century, there are some objections raised to moving away from the colonial style. And in particular, when the Gothic begins to come in, there are plenty of alumni who say Gothic is the wrong style for Princeton University. We should be building in colonial revival because our ancestors created Princeton as this great colonial American institution. And the style of that was classicism. And so we should continue to build in this classical style. That argument loses out. Otherwise, Princeton would be like, let's say, the University of Virginia or University of Delaware, where the campus is heavily, heavily classical. Not the case. Princeton is varied and eclectic and fascinating to explore, partly because they didn't keep that colonial approach, but they tried other things.
Now, when I hear Gothic Revival, I think European cathedrals, I think stained glass, I think medieval, a bit medieval looking. So are those elements that have been integrated into Princeton's architectural design?
I think what happens is that Princeton is very much focused on producing scholars that will serve the American nation. So this is all through the colonial period, through much of the 19th century. They're all men. So Princeton men trained on the Princeton campus, they go out and they found towns and institutions in places like Kentucky, Virginia, North Carolina. Princeton men fan out and really settle the South into the West. Princeton's very much an institution that's focused on that sector of the United States, the South and the West. Harvard and Yale have New England, but Princeton has the South and the West. And so Princeton is an extremely American institution. But by the late 19th century, people are starting to say, wait a minute, we're not just an American institution, we're a world institution. And we belong in the tradition of the great world universities, especially Oxford and Cambridge in England. And we think as Princeton grows and expands in the late 19th century, and Princeton starts to call itself not a college but a university, there's a lot of talk about we need to build like a university would build. And the natural style is Gothic, because that's what you see at Oxford, that's what you see at Cambridge. So around 1896, Princeton changes course dramatically and commits itself to building in what we call collegiate Gothic style, the style of Oxford University in England, the style of Cambridge. And so from about 1896 to 1930, Princeton reinvents itself as I think Yale is competition to this, but I think Princeton and Yale are the greatest Gothic Revival campuses in the United States. And some of the greatest assemblages of Gothic Revival architecture you're going to see anywhere. They're quite extraordinary.
I think it's really interesting that you can look at architecture and design through the lens of history and what's going on in the world around you at the time. And so that was actually very popular around that time period for America in general and academic institutions to want to emulate the English experience. I don't know if the curriculum changed at the same time, but I think if I'm not mistaken, there was in academic institutions, you saw a lot of the curriculum shift a bit from the traditional Latin Greek philosophy to include more sciences. I don't know if the timing was aligned or not.
I do think the 1890s are so interesting because Princeton triples in enrollment in a very short period of time, and Princeton is becoming modern. And one of the key questions is, what about the sciences? Should Princeton try to build laboratories? Should we go beyond the old model of studying the Bible, studying classical works of literature? Should we go beyond that and really build a huge science laboratory for biology, a huge physics laboratory, a huge chemistry laboratory? And if we do that, how do we keep that feeling of the old liberal arts institution that Princeton had always been? And so I think building in this Gothic style is a commitment that we're not going to lose our tradition of the student focused, undergraduate focused, Oxford like, in the close relationship of the professor to the student. It's very much, I think, a kind of inoculation of Princeton against too much modernity, because we didn't want to be like Johns Hopkins, for example. Johns Hopkins is the big upcoming school in the 1890s. It's where Woodrow Wilson went to graduate school. He strongly objected to what he called the Germanic teaching methods at Johns Hopkins and the great science laboratories and the whole urban flavor of Johns Hopkins. He thought that was the wrong way for Princeton to develop. And so building in this beautiful, aesthetic, Gothic style would ground Princeton in this long tradition of the English universities, going all the way back to the Middle Ages.
Interesting. Some of these other buildings on campus and some of their defining features. So is it Alexander
Alexander Hall.
Hall?
Mm-hmm. As Princeton grew rapidly in the late 19th century, of course, that's what we call the Gilded Age. And so you have a lot of very, very wealthy Princeton alumni, especially in New York City. These are extraordinarily wealthy men, and they want to give a great gift to the campus. And so they would give a building, and each wealthy donor would give a fabulously expensive building, and they would bring in their own favorite architect. And so you get this architectural pluralism with lots of different architects involved. There's no supervising architect. And so buildings go up in a riot of Victorian styles, all different styles, all different materials. And the great example of that is Alexander Hall, which was built as a commencement venue. In other words, it's a huge lecture hall where all the students would gather in their cap and gown. And then there's an ambulatory that wraps around the building. So the students would then go marching out in the famous parade we call the P-Raid, that's legendary in Princeton history. So Alexander Hall is very large, flamboyantly Victorian, in a Romanesque style of architecture. But it doesn't blend in. It doesn't try to blend in. It doesn't match any other building on the campus. When Princeton embarked on the great Gothic crusade and Gothic becomes the style, people said, well, we need to tear down Alexander Hall. I mean, it doesn't match the Gothic. It doesn't match anything. It was regarded as this kind of hideous carbuncle on the Princeton campus. And even when I was a student in the 1980s, there were older people who could well remember the calls to destroy Alexander Hall. Yale had a similar building, and they tore it down. I mean, you have to remember there was intense pressure to destroy Victorian buildings in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s. The wrecking ball was swinging everywhere in America as they tried to purge the landscape of what they considered these Victorian aberrations. Thankfully, though, they didn't tear down Alexander Hall. today it's been on a U.S. postage stamp. I mean, this is a famous building, and I think an exceptionally beautiful campus building. So you see, tastes change,
Hmm.
and if you don't tear it down, it might be terrible looking, but if you don't tear it down, your kids or your grandchildren will appreciate it, and they'll love that building, and they
Doesn't
will
that
thank you.
just
They'll
speak
thank you
to
for not
trends,
destroying it.
doesn't it? My mom used to tell me the same thing about clothes.
It's very analogous. Let me say a little bit about the Gothic Revival.
Yeah, please.
Gothic Revival architecture I find extremely interesting because the idea with Gothic is that buildings are part of a complex, and the complex grows over time. Think about the medieval cathedrals where you'd build the transept, and then 50 years later you'd build the choir, and then 100 years after that you'd get the money and you'd build a tower. But you only ever built one tower because there was never money for the second tower. So Gothic means you build it in pieces, and the pieces are kind of stuck together in funny, picturesque ways that don't always match, but have this charm to them because the whole Gothic complex is kind of agglomerated. It's the opposite of classical architecture. Classical architecture is rational, neat, orderly, arrayed in a clear pattern. Gothic is a jumble. And so I think what's fun about the Princeton campus when you visit is the buildings really look kind of old, and they really look like they were built at many different times. And yet they were all built in a quite short span of time, about 40 years. But they were made to look assembled in this picturesque, creative way. To me, that's the key to the Gothic aesthetic that gives it such energy and interest.
Well, and it's funny because if we're looking at American history, our history is relatively new, depending who you ask.
Yeah,
And I would look at Princeton's history as some of our oldest, if we're talking about architecture, design. And yet the idea was to emulate something even older. So
yeah.
it is really an interesting concept. That said, where did the landscaping, the quadrangles, what was that interplay or that evolution as it pertained to the campus, to some of these other buildings? And how did it contribute, I guess, to the overall story of the campus's design?
I think one of the most important pieces of the Princeton story is the landscaping because it's exceptional buildings, but it's the setting in this landscape that I find so interesting. And Nassau Hall, when they built Nassau Hall, they didn't put it right up on the street. They put Nassau Hall way back from the street, creating this huge open space in front of the main building. And then when they expanded the campus behind Nassau Hall, they created Cannon Green, which you can still see today. And it has a Revolutionary War cannon that's sunk in the ground in the middle of Cannon Green. Now, these open spaces were beautiful, but at the same time, they encouraged students to do something awful, which was to play baseball and play football. And the Presbyterian elders who ran Princeton, they were extremely unhappy when students were running around, tackling each other, and throwing footballs. They considered that if you got too hot and too cold in the same afternoon, you would probably die. So they planted trees everywhere to discourage the Princeton students from being able to play football.
Wow.
However, the students invented a new type of football that simply ran around amongst the trees, and that became part of the game. It was on the Princeton campus that intercollegiate sport was invented by the Princeton students playing baseball, playing football, just amongst the buildings on the campus. It's not until probably 1870s, 1880s that the university starts to build a gymnasium and actual sports facilities. Now, one of the things I think was always great about Princeton is that the sports facilities were near the dormitories. And the whole design of the campus insisted that you should be able to close your physics textbook and go out the door and you'd be on the playing field in minutes. You were supposed to be close to athletic activity. This is in the late 19th century when Teddy Roosevelt and others were encouraging athleticism as a manly outlet.
Mhm.
And so the integration all through the 20th century, the integration of the sports facilities and the rest of the campus, I think was one of the proudest achievements at Princeton. F. Scott Fitzgerald, the novelist, he talked about hearing the soccer players playing on the soccer field right outside his window.
Wow.
I can remember the fun of walking to class through the tennis courts and seeing people playing tennis in the morning. This has been lost in the last 30 years, but this was a very important part of the Princeton experience.
F. Scott Fitzgerald, did he study there or was he visiting or what was he doing there?
With the rise of intercollegiate football in the 1890s, Princeton became very famous. People followed Princeton football the way you would follow a great team of the NFL today. And
Mm-hmm.
so Princeton becomes a magnet for people who love sport and love fun. And Princeton, in a way, invents the modern idea of college as being fun. It had never occurred to anybody in the 19th century that it was going to be the least bit fun. But Princeton made it fun. And so F. Scott Fitzgerald out there in Minnesota, he hears about this wonderful school and this wonderful football team and everyone dressed up in sweaters and cheering in the bleachers on fall weekends. And so F. Scott Fitzgerald comes to Princeton, studies at Princeton. The First World War breaks out, and Fitzgerald says, I'm going to die in the trenches. He knew it. He knew he was going to die. In fact, a tenth of his class died in World War I from Princeton, a tenth of his class. And so Fitzgerald says, I'm going to write a great college novel, and then I'm going to go fight in the war, and I'm going to die. And so he writes This Side of Paradise, which became one of the great best-selling novels of all time. And it's about Princeton. It's about the Princeton experience. The president of Princeton hated it, wrote Fitzgerald an angry letter. How dare you portray us as, quote, the most delightful country club in America. But that too enhanced the image of Princeton, for better or worse. And Fitzgerald's name to this day is associated with Princeton University, although he actually then never graduated.
Wow. You did mention early, I think very early on in our conversation, that Princeton has sort of served as an inspiration, if you will, for other campuses. Do you have examples how its architecture has influenced architecture and design?
It is very interesting to me, Princeton's influence on the nation. I think no other university has had the influence aesthetically upon the United States as Princeton. Nassau Hall, that great colonial building, that was studied carefully. And you see replicas of Nassau Hall at many, let's say, Virginia and North Carolina universities. They have a copy of Nassau Hall because that was considered such a cutting edge, innovative design for a college building. You especially see this with the collegiate Gothic style. If you go to Duke, famous for its collegiate Gothic campus, and you stand in front of the Duke Chapel, and if you're a Princetonian, you say, yeah, that's the graduate college tower from Princeton stuck onto University Chapel from Princeton. I mean, the Duke Chapel is a pastiche of Princeton.
Mm.
And in fact, the famously Gothic Yale campus, we had the idea first, and then it was transported to Yale because it was such a success at Princeton. Not only that, but if you close your eyes and you think about campuses, you might summon up a Gothic image of what a campus is, with the pointed arches, the long colonnades, the soaring towers with the pinnacles on top. If you see that in your mind's eye, it's because countless commercials have been filmed on the Princeton campus, innumerable, from automobile advertisements in the 1950s up to Hollywood movies now, like A Beautiful Mind was filmed on the Princeton campus. And I always say to students, notice how they only film in the Gothic section of campus. You'll never see a commercial filmed in the 1960s dormitories where I had to live as a student, right? But this has spread. the Gothic idea of campus beauty nationwide. It's made it a meme or a trope for the whole country. The
Mhm.
idea that campuses should be Gothic and should be timeless and should embody these timeless ancient values aesthetically. I think that really does come from Princeton.
Now, the other thing I wanted to ask you about is kind of Princeton today and preservation efforts, because, you mentioned that even now Nassau Hall is one of the most well-preserved and, buildings of its time. What does perhaps the present and future of Princeton maybe look like from your point of view?
I'm a great believer in historic preservation because, frankly, each building represents a certain period in human history. Even a not very nice looking building built in 1955 is going to teach you a lot about what people believed in 1955. What materials did they have available to them in 1955? What were the philosophies of design that pertained to 1955? I think you really ought to try to keep as many old buildings as you possibly can. But on modern campuses, this has become a tremendous, difficult problem. How to keep these old buildings, because the old buildings tend to be too small for the greatly expanded student bodies that we have today. And there are not enough buildings. Woodrow Wilson was a great believer in keeping Princeton simple, keeping it about the basics, teaching the basics. That's not the philosophy today. The philosophy today is, let's build a center for social media studies. And here's some tech billionaire who's going to give the money for the Center for Social Media Studies. And then up goes another building. So that you can envision just buildings sprouting like mushrooms going forward. There's tremendous wealth at these major American universities. There's every opportunity to overbuild. And I think that's tremendous danger because the land really is not getting any bigger on the earth at the site of Princeton, but the number of desired buildings grows and grows and grows. So what loses out? Old buildings are torn down, and that priceless green space is intruded upon. And it begins to change the character of Princeton. And Princeton begins to go from this famously rural feeling campus to, oh, this is kind of like the University of Pennsylvania, which is in the heart of a big city,
Right. Yeah.
and it's sidewalks and buildings pressing up to the sidewalks and lots of glass. That's another issue, is how to build. How to build. Princeton was a campus of masonry architecture. That is, Princeton buildings traditionally were brick, or they were stone, or in more modern times they were concrete. But Princeton buildings were really not glass and steel as you looked at them. You didn't see great expanses of aluminum panels. You didn't see lots of metal. That's changed. Since 2000, Princeton has shifted, and much of the new architecture is very much glass and steel.
Mm.
And I sometimes talk to alumni groups and other groups, and I'll show 4 pictures on the screen, and they're all 4 modernist buildings. And I'll say 3 of these are pharmaceutical headquarters in Europe, and
Oh,
1 of these is a new Princeton
oh,
building. Which
no.
is which? And they can never tell. I think there you're losing something.
Mm-hmm. The architecture and design of these historic buildings. And, I often talk with interior designers and folks in the preservation community on this podcast. And time again, we tend to hear, if you are a fan of modern design and modern buildings, they're beautiful, but also in the right context. And a lot of the time, if we talk about homes, I personally have shared many a time on this podcast that an older home just exudes a certain level of history and charm and warmth, and there's a different feel that comes from it. And then a lot of the new builds that are kind of cookie cutter, it doesn't mean that they're not pretty in their own way or that they aren't aesthetically pleasing, but I am in a very historic area. And when you put these houses just on every available plot of land, and it's surrounded by things, and it sticks out because one of these things is not like the other,
Yeah.
and it sounds like the campus is perhaps experiencing, and this is not unique just to Princeton. This is campuses across the nation. A lot of these buildings, you see them coming up or even getting worked on or construction, and you just kind of wince a little because there are these beautiful historic campuses and they have the stone and beautiful glass. It does affect the overall aesthetic and the feel that you get. It doesn't feel quite as storied when you're walking around next to a parking garage. It is a little bit different. I don't know if that's part of kind of what you're suggesting, but that's, something I've certainly noticed.
Something I really started to think about when I was writing my book about Princeton, and you can apply this anywhere you go. Look at a building and ask yourself, does this belong to the age of handicraft, or does this belong to the age of the machine? And the cutting off point's about 1930. So an older building, the handicraft age. What's striking about those buildings, they're really built by hand. That is, someone quarried the stone for the foundation with a chisel. And somebody stacked up the stones in that wall by hand. And somebody carved those brackets on the porch. And you get this feeling of the involvement of the human hand. Whereas buildings after 1930 very largely are mass-produced pieces. So that today you can order a building over the internet and the
Yeah.
whole thing will arrive in trucks and you just assemble it. And this is true even for very expensive buildings. Take a look at some of the new things on the Princeton campus. There's no touch of the human hand. Everything there has been manufactured and shipped and bolted together. Now, that doesn't mean it's bad architecture. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying, for heaven's sakes, keep the old stuff. For heaven's sakes, keep the handicraft age buildings. They are more like Roman construction than they are like modern construction. They belong to this 2,000-year tradition that's really gone almost extinct in modern times. I think they're valuable, those old buildings. And I cringe when I see them torn down because those conditions that produced those buildings are never coming back.
Mm-mm.
All the craftsmen, they're gone. That economy is gone. That worldview is gone. You're not bringing that stuff back. Once you tear those buildings down, they are gone forever, forever, forever.
There are institutions that are known for their campuses. When all of the campuses start to look the same, some of that uniqueness and tradition dissipates. A lot of us feed off of our environments. Even learning, I went to a school that I happened, because I studied history and anthropology and archaeology, I had a lot of classes in a lot of the older buildings, which I'm so grateful for. And it made a big difference when I was in those buildings and I felt connected to history than when I was in the newer buildings that were essentially cinder blocks with terrible lighting. And it did make a big difference. Your environment really impacts your experience in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and it doesn't help, I think, at some of these modernizing universities that their view of history is basically a negative one. They'd like to escape from their own past, and they're in no mood to celebrate it. And I think that makes it hard to make the case where we ought to keep this building because it's been here for 150 years, woven into the fabric of this campus. Many of these administrators are not interested in that argument at all. They are looking ahead. They are saying, how can we compete with some other rival school in the 21st century? Arguments from tradition, heritage, those do not go over with a lot of these administrators. And it was striking to me at the time I wrote my book, Princeton had about half a dozen full-time people studying sustainability, how to make the Princeton campus sustainable. At that time it was corkscrew light bulbs. About half a dozen people and zero historic preservationists on staff, not even one. So you see where the priorities have shifted towards, I think, technologies and
Yeah.
away from the most sustainable thing of all, which is keep the whole building.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Well, fingers crossed. I
Yeah.
hope that things shift. And I've talked about this before too. Preservation doesn't mean stagnancy.
People are surprisingly not well versed in historic architecture. They're really not. And I noticed this at Princeton that these are the smartest people in the world. These are the most educated people in the world. But when you say to them, you need to save this building, this is from 1890 and you need to save it, they scratch their heads. They don't know who the architect was. They have no real sense of what architecture was doing in the 1890s. They really, and this is not just a Princeton problem, I think this is a cultural problem in America. We're
Mhm.
not well versed in historic architecture. And I would
Yeah.
just encourage everybody, educate yourself about the architecture of your community. Because 10 to 1, somebody's going to want to tear down that old building that you just love. And you got to have your arguments ready for why you shouldn't tear that building down. And I think you've got to educate yourself. That's why I wrote this book. I thought, look, Princeton is in danger of demolishing some of its heritage. Let's at least know what we're tearing down
Yeah.
before we tear it down.
Well,
At least you can look it up now and say, who was the architect? What was the date? Why was it built like that? Why was it placed there? What was the thinking? Before then you say, oh, it's that old thing, tear it
yeah.
down.
That's the kicker. And, I have said this before as well. So for those listening, I apologize. This is repeat information, but it can't be said enough. It is so important to understand the things that we just accept all the time. I think we sometimes become immune to our environments and immune to habits and traditions without actually educating ourselves. I use often material culture as an example of that. We find ourselves often, many of folks like myself, we love to shop vintage and thrift and antique. And there are things that have become trendy in that sphere. You look at ginger jars or, various forms of china. But a lot of folks are collecting it because they appreciate the aesthetic, which is wonderful. Do that. It's great. But I also think it's important that people understand what it is they are filling their homes with. And that education piece is so important. And that is a big part of why I wanted to talk with you too, because Princeton is a storied institution. And if we want it to remain so, preservation does play a big part in that. And there's a reason we have a narrow window of, folks I could even reach out to, because not all institutions have maintained that tradition, which is a shame. So yeah, you hit the nail on the head with that word, education. It's critical, and preservation is not a bad word. It doesn't mean we're clinging to the past. It means we're trying to bring the past into the present.
I could not agree more. I think you and I are on totally the same page there. And I think you would agree too that listeners, let's say you have this inkling that you like old things. You're drawn to old things. We live in this world of everything new and cheap. You are different. You are drawn to things from the past. I would say look and learn. Do those two things. Really look. I found that very few of my students were actually looking at architecture. And I encouraged them, don't look at your shoelaces as you walk. Look around. Study the architecture. Study the old things. This will make you a good collector too. It will enhance your whole life because you'll
Yeah.
be able to spot things that are rare and unusual and not just the ordinary, but something quite sophisticated. So you're looking and then educate yourself. Learn about this world of the past. Your whole life will be enhanced. I think one aspect that's fascinating, Princeton was the quintessentially all male campus. There were really no female students at all until the late 1960s, hardly any. So it was a bastion of football playing masculinity for centuries. And yet, in the midst of that, some women played important roles in designing the landscape of the Princeton campus. Edith Wharton's niece, Beatrix Farrand, she was the landscape designer. She came up with that striking Princeton aesthetic, which was no trees and no shrubs are going to get in the way of kids playing sports. The trees and shrubs under Beatrix Farrand were pushed up against the walls. She stapled the trees and shrubs to the walls of the buildings and let them grow up as espalier. And if you walk around Princeton, you'll see traces of what she did. And I just find that fascinating.
Hmm.
Most campuses are maple trees spreading their shade. Not so much at Princeton. It's big open spaces and then the plantings up against those Gothic walls. Also important is Ellen Wilson, who was the wife of Woodrow Wilson, president of Princeton. Ellen Wilson was very aesthetic. Ellen Wilson, a serious oil painter of landscapes. And Ellen Wilson planted a rose garden behind the president's house on the campus. And when she loved that rose garden, when they moved to the White House, Ellen Wilson said, "I wish we had a rose garden at the White House." And Ellen slipped and fell on a polished floor in the White House. And she sickened and she died. And so Ellen Wilson didn't live to see the fruition of her dream, but the rose garden at the White House originated with the Princeton University campus
Wow.
rose garden.
Oh my goodness. Thank you for sharing that. I never would have known
Sure.
that.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. Well, I'll make sure to share links to all the important things for folks to check out your work and your research. But this was wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time. This has been really enlightening for me, and I'm sure many others who are listening along. So thank you for sharing your wealth of knowledge in a small, condensed version for us.
Thank you so much, Allie. It was such a pleasure.